Gindi, Director of the Middle East Institute's Program on Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs. Welcome to this, our first session in our two-part series entitled Life Under Digital Occupation, the Global Implications of the Israeli Surveillance State. The Middle East Institute is pleased to be co-hosting this series with Hamle, the Arab Center for Social Media Advancement, a Palestinian NGO based in Haifa. In today's session, we'll be examining the impact of the Israeli surveillance state on the lives of Palestinians. In part two, we'll be talking about the situation beyond Israel and the occupied territories and the global implications of the Israeli state. So the internet is often seen as a space for free expression, virtually unrestricted access to information, and an opportunity to network with people all over the world. It is also seen as a highly egalitarian space where any individual or group, including traditionally marginalized voices, can have a local, national, and very often global audience and platform. But is this actually the case? And in particular, is it true for Palestinians as a stateless group, particularly those living under Israeli occupation? To help us understand this issue better, we've assembled a really incredible panel. I will list them here in alphabetical order, and then we will dive right into our discussion. First, we have Maryam Barghouti, who is a Palestinian writer and researcher based in Ramallah. Next, we have Sahar Francis, who is General Director of Ad-Damir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association. And finally, we have Nadim Nashif, co-founder and director of Hamle, our co-sponsor for this event, the Arab Center for Social Media Advancement. Keep an eye on the chat box for their Twitter handles and links to articles and other resources relevant to today's discussion. The format will be pretty straightforward. It'll be just a standard moderated Q&A. I'll kick off the discussion with a few questions, but we welcome your questions for our panelists as well from our audience members. You can submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can do that at any time during the conversation, and we'll keep an eye on those and try to incorporate as many of your questions as possible into our discussion. If you're having any technical problems, please use the chat box, and we'll have our team try to sort those out. Finally, please note that today's event is being recorded. And so with that, let's go ahead and begin. So I want to start with Nadim. Before we delve into the sort of nuts and bolts of our topic today, could you give us a basic lay of the land in terms of, first, the overall, what does the picture look like for Palestinians in terms of internet usage and connectivity in the occupied Palestinian territory? How plugged in are Palestinians in general compared to Israelis or others in the region? And secondly, on the technical side, what is the status of the Palestinian infrastructure and broader digital environment with regard to the 5 million Palestinians in the occupied territories? Which aspects of this infrastructure is controlled by Israel, which are controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and what implications does this have for Palestinians and their access to the internet and connectivity? And not to overwhelm you, but also if you could touch on the controversy and the problems associated with the 3G and 4G access for Palestinians in the occupied territories.
Thank you, Khaled. So yes, obviously, I mean, speaking from a digital rights perspective, the connectivity and to have access to internet is a right. As maybe it is obvious in some areas around the globus, in other areas, this is not something that is obvious, and accessibility levels and the quality that is there, and having the latest technology is not the case. Going back a bit in history, like since the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the Israeli government controls the Palestinian telecommunications sector, basically all the infrastructure, the telecommunications, the cables, etc. It went up to the early 90s with the Oslo Accords and Paris economical agreements between Israel and the PA. And the basic idea was that there would be at some point independent Palestinian state, and the Palestinian telecommunications sector would be also independent at a certain point. Now we know that neither happened, obviously, and the Israelis, the Israeli government still hold tight with the Palestinian infrastructure of telecommunication. So it means basically that the fibers, the cable, the physical cables go first through the Israeli side, and then it comes to the Palestinian side. But also the control is on the equipment, because the Israeli government control all the borders. So any equipment that the Palestinian telecommunication companies would want to bring in would have to get approval by the Israeli government. And this is not happening in many cases. And they make sure that there is a constant delay with the development. So the world right now is in 5G. In Gaza Strip, it's still 2G. In the West Bank, 3G. And this has happened recently, a year and a half ago. So the Israeli government is making sure that the Palestinians are still very much behind in terms of the telecommunication, in terms of the strength of the internet, the accessibility. And you can also imagine how much this is also compromised, because if you are controlling the infrastructure itself and things are going through Israel, it helps them also to control and to monitor and to surveil, obviously. But not only that, I mean, what's happening in order to understand it is that basically there is the cables that are coming to the Israeli side, and the Israeli side or the Israeli company is basically selling the internet to a Palestinian company. So the Palestinian customer in the end is paying much more and getting much less quality internet than the Israeli customer. So from all aspects that we can check it, obviously the situation is very bad, and this control comes as the whole domination and control, the system that we are living under, and the digital aspect is just one aspect of it, where they make sure to maintain their control on us.
Thank you, Nadeem. Sahar, I'd like to turn to you if you could flesh out the picture for us in terms of the legal environment in which all of this is happening. What sorts of civic, political, or human rights guarantees exist for Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation?
Hello, and thanks for including me in this webinar. This is a very complicated situation because actually Israel is imposing the rules not just inside the state against the Palestinians, citizens of the state of Israel in this case, but as well in the occupied territories that they occupied after 1967. And in the name of security, you can imagine that everything is justified by the needs of security and in order to protect the security of the state in both areas. So actually they're legalizing whether civil laws or military orders in a way that it will enable them to maintain this control and to use the information that they obtain in such surveillance technologies in the legal procedures, whether it's against you as a detainee, for example, if you're imprisoned for a case that is involving your social media activities or your emails or whatever, but not just this. This information that could be obtained by these tools can be used as well in other cases where it would be kept as well under secret file. This is very problematic when it comes for our context under occupation. The use of secret information that you as a lawyer or you as a person will never know what they have there in their hands. So how you can challenge this. And another problem when it comes for the use of information coming from the internet or the social media that it's very easy in the military court system, for example, that the court will take such information as authentic and to rely on it. It's not much that the military court enforce that this information couldn't be taken as granted automatically by the prosecutor in order to base convictions. So it's really very, very, like later, I think we can discuss more about our case as organizations and the designation and how they used all these resources taken from our websites, from other newspapers and so on. But it should be highlighted in the last couple of years, there is increase on attacking and arresting Palestinian activists, as I said, whether inside Israel, but mainly in the occupied territories based on information collected from the technological tools of surveillance that they control and they developed. And we're becoming, I would say, the Palestinians are the field of expertise for the Israelis. They experience these developments on us as people, and then they go and sell it for the outside world.
Thanks, Sahar. I think that's an important point. Mariam, as we know, social media are extremely powerful tools, not only in disseminating information, but also in popular mobilization. We've seen this, it's almost cliche to talk about social media and the Arab uprisings, but we've also seen social media play a huge part in the Black Lives Matter, and frankly, even in things like the January 6th insurrection here in this country. How do Palestinians, especially given these restrictions, how do Palestinian activists and civil society make use of these digital tools? Do they have ways of circumventing some of these restrictions, or give us a sense of how this the social media environment in Palestinian political activism?
I don't think I can ever really speak on behalf of all Palestinians, or the majority. I can speak from my personal experience. I think in terms of not just social media, but digital platforms generally, it has helped us in mobilizing, connecting, and relinking. So it has helped us access education, knowledge. I think a lot of people, when we speak about social media, we think about, okay, well, where is a protest happening? What is happening on the ground? But there are also spaces of education for us, especially with the restrictions that are imposed on Palestinians in accessing safe and protected education, that they have been spaces of knowledge production, spaces where our narrative, especially given the geopolitical fragmentation, we were able to relink with one another and defragment and de-isolate. And that means I can engage with Palestinians in Gaza. I can engage with Palestinians in forced exile. I can engage with Palestinians in historic Palestine. And that's kind of what mobilization means, to me at least. I don't see mobilization as simply being on the ground. It is the active pursuit of our right to be a single population, of our right for liberation and self-determination. And what social media allowed is for us to confront the narrative of policymakers and decision makers, of NGOs and humanitarian aid and the development sector. We were able to reclaim our narrative and rebuild it and reimagine together. And I think that's kind of what that space gave for us in terms of mobilization, but it also allowed us to take it a step further in terms that these spaces acted as archival spaces for our own testimonies and documentation of what's happening on the ground, so we can pursue accountability sooner rather than later. We're 70 plus years late, but to pursue actual accountability. And that's really what they have served for us. I find it very important because, again, it defragments us. It allows us to de-isolate ourselves, because Israel continuously builds itself on ensuring that we don't engage with the global community. And if we do, it says the image of terrorists and writers that are seen on CNN and BBC and Deutsche Welle. So it allowed us to engage through our own multidimensional and complex lens as a people.
Thanks, Mariam. I want to stick with you, if I could, for a moment. You talked about defragmenting and also getting out the Palestinian narrative. And so really what we're talking about is Israel is able to kind of curtail Palestinian activism in two ways. First, in terms of disrupting the ability of Palestinians to organize and mobilize effectively on the ground. And second, by hindering their ability to convey their messages and their grievances and aspirations to other audiences around the world. So let's talk a little bit about the first one, and we'll come back to the second. What are some of the ways that Israel uses digital technology to surveil or suppress Palestinian activism in Israel and especially in the occupied territories? Could you give us examples? I know we've seen, issues like closed circuit television cameras. There was a big issue a couple years ago when Israel wanted to install cameras at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel uses facial recognition software at checkpoints. Give us a sense of the kinds of tools that the Israeli surveillance state uses on Palestinians on the ground.
So we also need to keep in mind that Israel doesn't just use things to surveil. It uses them as weapons, right? And digital technology isn't just apps like Pegasus and Blue Wolf being installed on Palestinian phones and laptops and internets. Digital technology needs to be seen as also the drones that Israel uses to bombard Gaza. That goes part and parcel with everything I think we're discussing. We often forget that, which comes back to what Sahar was saying. We're being used as lab rats for Israel's weapon trade. And I think that this is the biggest travesty that's being missed out of all of it. But in terms of how it surveils Palestinians and represses us, it's multifold. So first, it's the development of software and applications that are installed without our consent on our private spaces and spheres, even in the cyberspace. And then these are used to either criminalize us and take us into military detention, ban us from entry or exit, and to also manipulate the Palestinian narrative. So repression shouldn't just be seen as direct. It is also the indirect repression through working with tech companies and corporations to censor Palestinians. It is using our social media content to have us fired from our jobs, as we have seen with Palestinians that had previously worked with the United Nations being attacked and their content used so they can get fired. And then this is the way Israel uses what access it has to our lives is to blackmail us. It is to coerce us, and it is to manipulate the narrative across the spectrum. So I really think that what we need to see is not just the mechanism, but the goals that Israel is achieving through its strategy.
Thanks, Mariam. Sahar, I want to come back to you, particularly since you alluded to your case. One very effective tool that Israel uses to repress Palestinian activism in both the physical and virtual realms is terrorism. And specifically by expanding the traditional understanding of terrorism in terms of who or what is a terrorist, what constitutes actual terrorism. Israel's definition goes well beyond violent acts or even attacks on civilians. In 2016, for example, the Israeli military broadened their definition of incitement to include expressions of solidarity with, quote, terrorists and terror groups. And that's particularly notable because I think every Palestinian political organization, including the PLO, but certainly groups like Hamas, but even Fatah are designated officially, are prohibited as terrorist organizations. And then last October, Israel took the extraordinary step of designating 6 prominent Palestinian NGOs, including your own organization, Ad-Damir, as terrorist organizations. So what is behind this designation? What impact does it have? Does this sort of very expansive definition of terrorism have on your ability to function, mobilize, get your message out, particularly in the digital realm? And how does it affect the Palestinian struggle more broadly?
First, allow me to remind ourselves that it didn't start just in the anti-terror legislation in 2016. Israel was using the British security regulations since actually the first day of the establishment of the state back in 1948, when they occupied Palestine and colonized Palestine. And in these security regulations, there is a very wide definition of terrorism, even if it's not called clearly terrorism. But I mean, the Israelis were using these rules against the Palestinian community inside Israel to illegalize any kind of political activism or any kind of social movement that was aiming to resist the Israeli policies. And later they used the same regulations in the occupied territories. And this is how it ended up that the PLO, all Palestinian political parties, hundreds of organizations, the student movements, charitable organizations are actually illegalized. And this is how Israel actually is using all. So it's not just being a member in these groups that would be a crime, but supporting these groups, working in their behalf, representing them, being associated, all these are actually illegalized in the military orders. And this was the main tool for Israel for the control that they imposed on our society on the different levels. I totally agree with Maryam that there is different layers of the use of the technology with the legal process in order to maintain the control over the Palestinian people. So what happened in October by design, like issuing this order against the organizations, it was after a long years of harassment, intimidation, smear campaign, by using the technology and the social media, the Facebook, the Twitter, all the technology that the Israelis had by the Israeli right-wing group in order to attack us. And because we have a very good professional reputation, they failed in this smear campaign. So they came to the level where they forced actually to use the law, the legal system, the anti-terror laws in order to silence us. So in our case, they used both legal systems, the Israeli law that theoretically it wasn't supposed to be implemented on us in the occupied territories. Israel cannot implement their own civil law in the occupied territories, and also the military order system. It's all came together in order to dry our resources, to shut us down and silence us, because what bothered them, our work on the international level, not just on the advocacy like we do today, the raising awareness and all the changing of the narrative and with the international organizations, but mainly as well the accountability aspect via the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that we succeeded. The work on the PDS level, the movement, the association, like in our case in Ad-Damir, I'm sure that it bothered them the way how we are trying to connect struggles, like the case of the Palestinian prisoner in the Palestinian context is totally connected and should be connected to what's going on in the United States and in other conflict cases where regimes are using these techniques in order to oppress people and imprison and control more and more people.
Thanks, Sahar. Nadim, I want to come to you for the second part of this dynamic in which Israel is also able to interfere with the Palestinians' ability to project and convey their own messages about their own perspectives, their grievances, and so on. In theory, social media is supposed to offer a way for marginalized groups to have their voices heard, right? I mean, people no longer need CNN or the New York Times to get their message across. But when it comes to Palestine and the Palestinians, it seems like social media might actually, instead of leveling the playing field, might actually be deepening the already high degree of asymmetry between Israelis and Palestinians. So what are some of the ways that Israel uses to censor or restrict Palestinian activism outside the areas that it actually controls on the ground?
Yeah, so Israel has been doing systematic efforts since 2016 to silence the Palestinian narrative on social media through different tactics and strategies. Part of them are the whole issue of surveillance by the government agencies and the secretive agencies and the army, the secret services, the police, etc., who all of them basically survey Palestinian social media accounts, as we know, using different technologies. And as we know, all of this material comes basically to the cyber unit in the Israeli Ministry of Justice. So the cyber unit basically is the focal point between the social media companies and the government of Israel. And they are the ones who are requesting different takedowns and closing accounts and communicating with the social media companies. They coerced, or the companies are actively involved with them, but the result is basically that, as we know, for example, the number from 2020 that was declared by the head of this unit is that they had more than 20,000 requests to social media companies. When we say request, we speak about an email that has an Excel sheet with many different requests inside it. So you can imagine how huge this phenomena and how systematic work is being done through this unit and others to takedowns. Now, the results, according to this director of this cyber unit, is that 89% of the cases are being responded in a positive way. So the vast majority of their requests is being responded in a positive way, meaning that there are lots of takedowns. Now, the ironic point here is that this is called the voluntary relationship between the cyber unit and Meta and other social media companies. But the Israeli government is now in a process of legislation of a Facebook bill. And this Facebook bill will make the relationship basically compulsory, obligatory, because it gives the power to courts basically by the request of the general attorney to the courts with one side with secret evidence to issue orders to social media companies and generally websites to make takedowns of content that by their definition is inciting or as they define it, harmful content. Now, we know that the main harm would be on Palestinians, again, from these such kind of laws. But it would be, again, it's interesting to have this, to look at this unit that, you know, they have all the options and there are huge amounts of takedowns and 90% almost of positive response, but they want to have 100% control on the internet and the social media companies. So it's amazing to see this. And it's also, we have to also see the other side of it is that it's not only the official Israel who's doing this. There are the Congos, the governmentally, NGOs who are supported by the Israeli government and pretend that they are NGOs, but actually they are financially and strategically coordinated with the Strategic Affairs Ministry, like ACT-IL for IL. So these groups are also acting as some kind of online brigading, and they are reporting through different applications. You basically, they have tens of thousands of subscribers who get notification and they report certain content, and basically they are abusing the system because in most of the cases they don't even understand what they are reporting and they don't know Arabic. But it's just somebody sending them a notification and then they are reporting. So this happening.
Nadim, if I could, sorry, Nadim, just to ask you to clarify, when you're talking about these other NGOs that are affiliated with Israeli government agencies, you're talking about outside of Israel, right? You're talking about in other countries.
They are in and outside. I mean, the
Okay.
people that they have in those applications are both like different people who are supporters of the Israeli government inside the country and outside the country. You know, it's the internet, so basically they are reporting also content that is outside the borders. But the result is having those efforts and having also the whole issue of content moderation that's coming from the companies themselves, because you know there are many articles written about how much social media companies are much more suspicious towards Arabic content and over-moderating Arabic content. Generally, I'm speaking not specifically, but then adding to the whole issue of the Palestinian context and basically the whole DOI list, dangerous organizations and individuals, which means that many of the Palestinian parties and the public personalities are also part of this list. So any talk about them would also we would encourage automatic removal. So basically what I'm trying to say that there is a systematic effort that's happening from the Israeli side and from the companies, and this cooperation leads to a place where we see it as an attack on our narrative.
Thanks, Nadim. And also you mentioned 90% compliance. Who are you referring to in that 90%? Israel asked who to take down these websites or these content?
Yeah, so the head of the cyber unit was referring to cooperation from the side of the social media companies. I assume mainly it's Meta because it's the biggest one that most of the Israelis and the Palestinians are there. But it could be also, I mean, that he's also referring to TikTok and to Twitter. I mean, their cooperation and their pressure on these companies is also something that's ongoing.
Thanks, Nadim. Sahar, I'd like to come back to you because in addition to your organization being designated as terrorist, Damir was also, and other NGOs have also been targeted directly by the high-tech Israeli soft spyware known as Pegasus, developed by the cybersecurity firm NSO. Tell us what Pegasus is and how it works, and what happened to Damir and other organizations, and why you think you're being targeted.
Actually, I should say that so far this is what we discovered, that we were subjected to the Pegasus, but God knows what other technologies were used against us, because when I'm thinking about the fact that they raided physically the office of Damir at least 3 times, I don't know honestly what they put there, and if they put anything, and if they copied our server, what else they did in order to follow us.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there's a problem with the sound. We can hear you, but it's a little bit mechanical of a sound it's a little bit distracting. I'm wondering.
I need to disconnect and reconnect. So
okay.
If you can go to Miriam and I'll come back.
Okay. Sorry for that. Okay, so Miriam, also you also were targeted, and since we were Nadim was talking about the social media companies, I think you were targeted specifically by Twitter, and we saw actually during the last conflict and the conflict surrounding the Jerusalem expulsions and then the ensuing Gaza war, there were many instances in which Palestinian activists and their allies were being deplatformed, content was removed, people were kicked off of platforms, one of them being you. So tell us about what happened to you on with Twitter, how prevalent those kinds of experiences are.
Welcome back, Sahar. The military assault on Gaza and the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem. I think you used a little bit of a euphemism there, Khalid, in terms of reflecting those realities. Were taking place, and of course, Palestinians were sharing their testimonies on social media. Myself and many others, many Palestinians in Palestine, outside, as well as allies, were having content taken down or their accounts taken down. My own Twitter account was suspended for violating Twitter policies when I was covering confrontations of Palestinians against the Israeli settler militia near Ramallah, as well as the Palestinian Authority's repressive practices. And that evening, my account was shut down under the pretext of violating the policy. But I do also want to point out that once my account was turned off or my tweets were suspended, it was others that noticed and called it out and called Twitter out. And so my tweets were immediately reinstated almost. And I think it's because I had that kind of visibility. But in terms of the censorship, I think it's really important to notice how multi-layered it is. Censorship isn't just the removal of accounts. It is also the designating of certain content as sensitive or violating of policies. And it is the denial of our ability to say things like Al-Aqsa because the researchers at Twitter and Instagram were incapable to actually perform the right research and understand the Arabic terms. So we end up being censored because of the algorithm and the coding that was built insufficiently and through a very racist ideology. And I think it reflects that as well. And then there's the active censorship and inactive censorship, or direct and indirect. Directly, it is the removal of our content. Indirectly, it is this systemic, years-long policy by Israel, as well as global communities and global state actors, to inflict fear and intimidate us so that we reach a point of self-censorship. And I don't think we delve into that, how Palestinians are afraid to say the word resistance because Israel, for example, detained Darim Tatur for saying the word resist in 2015 and imprisoned her in her home. Again, so it's self-censorship is also a form of coerced and manipulated censorship by the state. And then it brings you to the tech companies that are not only sharing our information so freely and collaborating with the Israeli authorities to shut us down and silence us, but we really need to hold them accountable. These are non-state actors. These are third-party actors that are directly aiding and abetting the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And I don't think we need to speak just about the ways censorship is happening. Let's start calling out the actors in it, the formal and informal, state actors and non-state actors. Because for me, this is digital warfare. And I really do think everyone's noticing that the mechanism of war is also changing as we continue to change as collective human societies. So we really need to start recognizing that censorship is it's another tactic to put a black light on the actual practices on the ground. And it is a weapon that is being abused and misused.
Thanks, Maryam. Sahar, I want to come back to you and let you finish telling us about your experience with Pegasus.
So is it better now?
Yes.
You can hear me? Yeah. So as I said, it's the Pegasus, we discovered that they were using Pegasus, but honestly, I don't know if they're using any other techniques against us. What happened that actually Al-Haq organization discovered the fact that we may are subjected to these technologies by chance. 3 days before the designation. And this is why we believe that the designation came as a reaction for this discovery, because actually the basis for the information they claimed they based their designation on was existing a couple of months before the real designation. Why they waited all these months if we were really very terrorist people? What happened that the field researcher of Al-Haq discovered something weird in his mobile, and he informed the organization. Then with the support with human rights defenders and other organizations, we discovered that his mobile is followed. And this program, it seems that they can activate it without you getting anything. Like it's zero, how you describe it in the technology. They don't need to send you a message. They do nothing. You don't know that someone is hacking your mobile, and they are also able to use it as they have physically your mobile. So they can send messages, do calls, activate the camera, the microphone, everything, as they are using fully your mobile. And then we started to do the follow-up, and we discovered that also one colleague in Domir was facing this, and our lawyer from Jerusalem, and he's facing a deportation, like they revoked his residency. And other colleagues, like the director of Bisan Center, he's an American citizen as well, and three other colleagues from other organizations, including, by the way, the Palestinian Foreign Ministry, one person that he's following, he's doing very involved in the work with the ICC, that his mobile as well was subjected to the Pegasus. So it's very serious. And this is, you want to ask me something?
No, I was just going to clarify. ICC, for those who don't know, is the International Criminal Court. But please continue.
Yeah, I wanted also to highlight what Miriam was saying about the self-censorship and the use of the content in the legal cases I described. Like it's really very easy for the system to criminalize you, not just to close your Facebook page or your Twitter account or and this is the way how they are imposing this control, because thinking about the tens of students and activists and young people, sometimes children, that they would be arrested and imprisoned for a post that they shared, or a poster, or any sentence, even if it's very simple for them, that would be considered so easily as an incitement, and you would be imprisoned for this for 7 months or 8 months or 9 months in prison. This is really impacting the whole society at the end of the day, because today it's you, tomorrow it could be your classmates, and this is how they develop this fear of being able to use these platforms in a free way, and to share your opinions, and to dare to have it as a platform for discussion, for real discussion.
Thanks, Sahar. Which also, I think, raises an important question which we haven't touched on, and I hope that that each of you will address how what is the role of the Palestinian Authority, which also has imprisoned people for Facebook posts or for organizing on social media and so forth. So the tools of repression aren't used exclusively by Israel. So I'm just going to throw that out there, and then each of you can tackle that as you see fit. But I want to come back to Nadim. Can you give us a sense of how prevalent or common are cases like Maryam's or the experiences of Damir, and also to push you down in another area? Israel's surveillance state extends not just to speech and political activism, but to policing also things like money transfers to Palestine from abroad. Money transfer apps like Venmo, WeTransfer, PayPal have repeatedly blocked payments to entities simply for mentioning the word Palestine or Palestinian. So on what basis are these happenings? Is this just a technical glitch in the code, in the algorithms? Or is there something more, is there a human element involved in this as well? And how can you overcome this, and how can these companies be held accountable?
Yes, well, I mean, about the takedowns and accounts, I just want to mention that we at Hamle run a project or a platform that's called HOR, and we monitor different cases. So it's also, I will be adding the URL in the chat box later on. So people also, if they face cases of takedowns or account restrictions, they can also approach us, and we will be happy to help in that. Going back to the issue of the digital economy, I mean, there is a siege. I mean, the siege is not only physical, it's also in the digital world, again, with the domination and the control. And for example, PayPal, which is like the biggest, it's actually a monopoly. And they own also Venmo and other smaller platforms. Most of the payments happen there, and Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip cannot use PayPal. It's not just a glitch or a problem, it's a policy. There are over 200 countries and territories around the globe that use this platform, and there are 30 that are not allowed to use it. A part of them is also Palestinian territory. I mean, so basically, as an Israeli settler, you can use this freely. If you live in Psagot settlement, for example, and a few kilometers away, if you're living in Ramallah, you cannot use PayPal or its other companies. And this is obviously very problematic in the world that we are living in. I mean, there are lots of people, especially for young Palestinians who are graduates of universities, who know English, and can also work as freelancers with different, we know that lots of professions these days are working from home, from far away, including professions like coding, translation, graphic design, and others. So it could be a change or a very different situation for those young people who can have access to more jobs. And we know that the high rate of unemployment, especially in Gaza Strip, and this could be something that is really significant. Unfortunately, Hamli and other Palestinian and international civil society have been calling, writing petitions and running campaigns in front of this company, and until now without any success. And this is problematic also because the Palestinian banking system did lots of reform in order to reach the international standards and requirements. So there is no technical reason. Like, what we believe is basically that they got some advices from the Israeli side about, you know, like the usual arguments of money laundering, financing terror, etc. That it's too small market, it will be a headache for you, etc. And that's why the company decided not. I mean, the official argument would be that we do not operate in places that have political and economical unrest. And obviously, this is to be determined in which places according to their political pressure and understanding. You are muted, Khalid.
Of course I am. Maryam, I want to come to you next. Feel free to address the question I raised about the role of Palestinian authorities in the realm of digital repression. But also I want us to start thinking about what can be done about all of this. What forms of redress do Palestinians have, either as individuals, as organizations in civil society, or even political leaders, if any? Some have suggested, for example, one remedy might be for the international community, and especially for tech companies, to recognize a Palestinian state in this, you know, along the lines of the 2012 UN General Assembly resolution. Would that be enough? Is that going to give Palestinians more tools to combat this sort of thing? I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but please go ahead.
Shukran, Khalid, thank you. In terms of the role of the Palestinian Authority, I think it's important to remember the Palestinian Authority is a creation of the settler colonial project. It came into existence under Oslo in the 90s. So we really need to recognize that it's an expired regime. And it's one which enacts oppressive practices against Palestinians. Under presidential decree, you have laws like the cybercrimes law being released in order to repress Palestinian political activists. You have the Palestinian Authority also employing surveillance on Palestinians and sharing that information with Israeli authorities. So I really think the role of the Palestinian Authority is to be held accountable and seize its authoritarian practices, which we know no authoritarian regime just seizes or forgoes its power. So it's about us holding them accountable as a collective, Palestinians first, but as a collective global community as well. In terms of the redress for Palestinians, I think we need to move away from the conversation of statehood, right? It's kind of part and parcel of why we're here, the rise of states and then colonial empire. I don't think recognizing Palestine under the 2012 resolution will achieve anything. It basically gives us Vatican status, not really statehood, right? The Vatican has more power as a non-member observer state. But more than this, what tech companies need to recognize, one, is their obligation as non-state actors and their responsibility towards, if we want to speak about the international human rights framework, they have an obligation. What they need to recognize is Israel is an apartheid state. What they need to recognize is that what's happening in Palestine is ethnic cleansing. What they need to recognize is the Palestinian population in and of itself. Beyond this idea of statehood, we're still imagining our liberation and what shape or form it'll take. And that's our right. We have the right to decide our own fate. So I think we should move away from the idea of statehood and bring it back to what's really happening on the ground. If you recognize Israel as an apartheid state, if you recognize the ethnic cleansing that is happening here, then you will ipso facto start creating these policies that prioritize human life, that prioritize safe spaces, that prioritize protection, all these terms that fall under statehood, right? But in practice, rather than just let's outline how we want to engage global communities. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Mariam. And Nadim, I'd like to come to you and ask you, there's been at least one tech company that has taken some sort of action, partly in response to the criticisms that have been leveled against it, that it was unfairly targeting Palestinian voices. Facebook, or now Meta, created an oversight board to look into the issue. And one of the things that the oversight board did, aside from expressing concern that Israel and other governments might be unduly influencing Meta's content moderation and policing, is that it called on Meta to launch an independent investigation into whether its standards were being applied without bias. Is this a positive step? Is this a model for other tech companies to follow? What is the status of that investigation, as far as you know, and what impact would you expect it to have?
Yeah, so this is a good development, a positive development. So basically what happened that after May and the pressure, huge pressure that was happening from the side of activists, influencers, and others, and the coverage that happened also from mainstream media outlets and also from different civic society actors, it created pressure that we didn't see before on Meta. And it led to a discussion. Basically, the oversight board was discussing a specific case of a content by Egyptian journalist who was reporting content about Hamas. And the discussion was if they should take it down or not, because as we know, Hamas is part of the terrorist list of the US government. The decision of the oversight board was to resend the post, because this is a journalistic work, and the journalist is reporting on what's happening on the ground in Gaza, and it should be there. But they also recommended the company that there should be a check, and this came from many organizations like Hamle, who were asking to have audit for the policies of content moderation of Facebook about their content moderation in Arabic and in Hebrew, because clearly there is over moderation on Arabic and specifically when it comes to Palestinian content, and there is hardly any content moderation when it comes to Hebrew. In brief, so basically the company agreed and they commissioned PSR. PSR is an NGO based in the US that works on the intersection between human rights and business. I mean, the fact that somebody is checking this and that Facebook or Meta by their new name now agree to that, it means that there is a problem, because normally they would say we have a global policy of content moderation that goes for anybody around the globe, and we don't have any specific agreements with the Israelis and you know, these kind of arguments. So now, at least in a way, in an maybe direct way, they are admitting that there is a problem and somebody that it need to be checked, and I think this is a progress. Now, I mean, I don't expect that this committee will solve the whole issue. And unfortunately, they also restricted the examination for May and June, not the whole years back. But at least this is a step forward, and there is a recognition inside the company that they have a problem there and that they need to check it and to examine it again.
Thanks, Nadeem. Sahar, I want to come to you, and it looks like you will probably have the last word of the panel. I want to ask you about the international realm. We've seen, obviously, the tech giants like Meta and Google and others have enormous power, in some cases more power than many governments around the world, but are still largely unregulated. Are there ways to make them more responsive or accountable to their constituencies that they serve, especially those outside of the US, right? Since these are mostly US-based companies, and so there is some regulation, but not necessarily regulation by all of the populations that are affected. Should big tech companies be asked to endorse things like international human rights treaties and conventions the way governments do? To what extent is international law even an effective tool in pushing back on these types of digital repression and overreach by the tech giants?
So basically, what is existing in the international level is the standards for human rights and businesses, and on the UN level, which means that yes, big companies are requested to be respecting international human rights law, especially because they are not acting just in one state. They are transnationals, and this is why they have responsibilities. The problem with the international law, though, is the implementation, because you know the UN don't have a police, and they cannot force people as they cannot force states to respect international laws. So what's the alternatives that we have? And I would highlight the fact that the UN Human Rights Council issued the blacklist. This is a very very good work that the Palestinian and international human rights groups were putting pressure for so long in order for the Human Rights Council to publish this blacklist of international corporations that they are benefiting from the occupation, which makes them complicit in international crimes. And this is a opening for accountability. So basically, the UN is asking these organizations to withdraw or to respect their duties according to the international law. Otherwise, we can ask people to boycott and to sanction these organizations. So basically, if we fail to take a legal specific case against any of these companies, big companies, whether Facebook or Google or any other company, at least we can campaign against them if they don't want to respect. And it's not just about the Palestinians' rights, it's about human rights in the international level. You should respect human rights everywhere and without double standards policies. And we should use the power of the people to boycott and divest from these companies in order to push them to respect their responsibilities according to the international human rights law.
Thank you, Sahar. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I know we've only just scratched the surface, but I want to thank our panelists, Sahar, Nadeem, Mariam, for a really excellent discussion. And thank you all for attending, and especially those of you who submitted questions. Be sure to tune back in for part 2 of this series, which I think is going to be March 15th, or check the website. We hope to see you